Hello, everyone, and welcome to Anything Joe's, a collaborative journey through the world of G.I. Joe. My name is Greg Engel,
And I'm Jaron Decker.
and we'll be your hosts. Before we get started, let's talk about ourselves just a little bit. I am I guess what you'd call a diehard, lifelong G.I. Joe fan. I started collecting G.I. Joe right almost immediately when they launched around Series 2. I got an Airborne for Christmas, and I also got the Mobat, which came with Steeler. And I mean, there have been ups and downs, but I kind of never stopped collecting since then. I've bought, and especially when the modern line started, like the 20th and 25th anniversary stuff came out, I was all in on that. Then went back and bought lots of vintage stuff as well. I bought even stuff that's not looked particularly well upon, like the Sigma 6 line, and I collected original G.I. Joe art. I've had G.I. Joe art commissioned. I've lived and breathed it for a long time. I've given up other collections to focus on it exclusively as I've gotten older. Yeah, so I love it, and I love talking about it.
I mean, when I met you, that was like one of the first things I think we talked about was that you were into G.I. Joe. And that was like your thing, you know? It was like Greg's the G.I. Joe guy, for sure.
It has certainly become a definitive characteristic of mine along the way. But it's like one of those things where you're really into Star Wars stuff, right?
Yeah.
So you reach a certain point where you have to dial it back a little bit. Mm-hmm. So instead of opening up those windows and being like, hey, what do you guys think about G.I. Joe? I've learned over the years to be like, only talk about G.I. Joe if someone approaches you and says, oh, hey, I like your G.I. Joe t-shirt. Otherwise, you look like an insane fanboy. So yeah, it's definitely one of the things it is a defining character. If you know me, you definitely know that G.I. Joe is one of the things that I live and breathe.
Yeah, I think you have a tattoo, right?
Yes, I have the Snake Eyes Arashikage tattoo on my arm.
Yeah, I thought you had the one on it's like on your forearm. I think that's what happened is I was like, hey, I recognize that. That's G.I. Joe. And you were like, oh boy, you talked about G.I. Joe. Let's go.
I have it. I mean, it's everywhere. It's all over our house. I have posters signed up. I have all my figures up. Even as we're packing, I'm still leaving stuff hanging around just because I enjoy looking at them. Changing the way they're positioned or re-displaying them a different way.
Well, I have always kind of known about G.I. Joe. Like, I mean, I was a kid and they had G.I. Joe cartoons when I was a kid. I don't remember which one, obviously. But G.I. Joe was never like my thing. Like, it was never my thing. I was a Star Wars kid. I grew up with the prequels, so sorry. But
lucky.
Yeah. But I always knew of G.I. Joe, but I was never super into it. There's a few characters that I can kind of like remember. Mostly, of course, Snake Eyes, as everyone knows Snake Eyes. But then, like, when we had worked together, you talking about G.I. Joe made me like get a little more interested and kind of want to know. And I mean, I'm still a primary Star Wars collector. I mean, I've got the Black Series, I've got some vintage collection, I've got some of the actual original Kenner stuff. But I'm starting to look more into getting some G.I. Joes, and through talking with you, it makes me kind of, it's almost to the point where I'm like, I know most of the things about Star Wars, and I want to learn something new. And so being able to kind of jump in and getting to talk to you and you kind of teaching me things about G.I. Joe and, you getting to tell me something you're passionate about and seeing that, it kind of makes me want to know even more.
So let me ask you this. I know that you picked up the deluxe edition 6-inch Snake Eyes that came out recently. Do you have any other G.I. Joe stuff at all?
I have a Cobra t-shirt.
Mm-hmm.
And I have the original crossover comic book with Transformers.
Oh, right on. That's a great story.
That is it.
Wow.
That is all of my G.I. Joe stuff.
We'll take care of that. We'll fix that.
I have the other ones on pre-order as well, so those will be here eventually. My Destro, Duke, Roadblock, Scarlet, all of them. And the regular Snake Eyes, which I like because it's just slightly different, so I'm going to have to buy it too.
That paint scheme is a little bit more on point.
But
I had to have the deluxe edition as well. I try to get, I don't want to say one of everything, but I try to get everything that's feasible for me to collect.
Yeah, it just seemed like with the deluxe they were trying to go more realistic, which especially now that you see the guns with the regular release, it definitely looks more realistic because it has a more realistic Uzi. It has the pistol looks more realistic. Like everything just looks more like a real. He's got more like gunmetal gray stuff like that. So then the regular release looks like just straight up black Snake Eyes, and I think it looks slick. Now, granted, I'm gonna love them both.
Anything that comes out that's any sort of exclusive, especially if it's a Hasbro exclusive, it's like get it now or wish you got it later because
Yeah.
that stuff goes so fast. And then it almost immediately goes up in value. It's harder to get. Anytime I've ever missed a San Diego Comic-Con exclusive that they've sold online, or Toys R Us used to sometimes get like a second offering of that stuff. I mean, you'd have to be there. Like it was one of those things where you were pressing F5 on your keyboard, just just anxious, just waiting on that page to come up. Like it was that kind of, but just breakneck speed where you'd have to be there and get it, or you would. I mean, there have been times where I have been there, it's sold out, and well, like I couldn't even get to the checkout with it, and then I would have to immediately go on the eBay and pay like double or maybe even triple because I had to have it.
It's just so sickening with that kind of stuff, really.
Well, luckily it comes, at that time in the GI Joe world, sometimes the convention exclusives would be the only thing that would come out all year.
Yeah.
So you were like, well, this is my yearly budget for it.
It's just crazy because, like like I said, I'm a Star Wars guy, so Black Series stuff. I mean, there's stuff that sat on a shelf for years, and then now because it's harder to find now, it's over $100 for a $20 figure, and it's just crazy, And the deluxe Snake Eyes, it was 49 when it came out, and it's over doubled, right?
Yeah, it's bad. Of course, I come from let me tell you about the G.I. Joe Collectors Club sometime where every figure was a minimum of $40. You had to commit to buying 12 figures at once.
Oh,
Oh, God. Good. I mean, good stuff came out of that, but man, you talk about really deep, you got to be deep pockets to get into that deep.
I was actually going to ask you. I thought you would remember. I mean, of course you remember the Collectors Club. That's like
Yeah.
a badge of honor. Like that's like a battle wound.
Well, the crazy thing is that I was a Collectors Club member for like maybe the last, I don't know, maybe half of the entire run of the Collectors Club, because I was either like not a really aggressive collector at the time, like, or I couldn't afford it, basically.
Yeah.
So I missed like at least the first four waves probably, and there's some great stuff in there that I've over time very slowly been like, all right, now I'm going to buy this Cover Girl, now I'm going to buy this Slice and Dice, and those are all huge purchases. Those are like
That was the Cover Girl. That was Ron Rudat's favorite, right? That was
Scarlet.
one-
Scarlet is Ron Rudat.
Oh, was it? Okay, I
Yeah,
thought he was
yeah.
really into Cover Girl as well.
Yeah, so there's a bunch of figures from those first waves that I wasn't able to get then, are just really expensive to pull the trigger on for just one single figure. But over time, I've slowly been like, all right, now things have been slow. I haven't bought anything in a while. I'm gonna splurge and buy just this one figure and mark it off.
uh, it's a struggle bus, but it's what we do to ourselves, right?
I mean, it is very fulfilling when you get one. I'll say that.
Yeah.
Okay, so with that out of the way, let's talk a little bit about the intent and what we're hoping to accomplish here. When we decided to form a G.I. Joe themed podcast, we really wanted to explore the origins and various continuities of the G.I. Joe universe and examine how that's evolved over the years. We want to dive into different universes. I'm a huge fan of talking about characters that have been overlooked or they don't really have a definitive origin. Anything like that that drives our passion. We hope that you, the community, will want to go on that journey with us, sharing stories of what G.I. Joe means to you, why certain characters stand out, what you consider to be the definitive stories and figures of the line.
Yeah, I'm super excited, jumping in so fresh and so new to kind of learn all of that background, but also like to see, okay, what does this mean to people, and to kind of learn things that I didn't know, but also like to theorize and like to really think about, okay, well, this character doesn't have much more than just the file card. What can we kind of expand upon, and what possibilities can we create, and really just the biggest thing is about having as much fun as possible along the way.
Absolutely. And you can reach out to us on any of our social platforms. We're on Twitter. You can, anything Joe's podcast at gmail.com. We want to hear from you. You can email us and, tell us what you think, what you want to see, your own personal experiences. We want to share that with everyone else in the community as well. So when it came time to start a show, have a first episode, I didn't know what other topic to cover other than to explore the origin of the line itself, including the birth of Hasbro, how it was formed, how G.I. Joe was developed, and where it went from there. And while we know this particular story is a tale as old as time.
Oh no, not again.
Joe's for you and me.
Oh.
Two good bestest friends.
I'm going to have to quit. I'm going to have to resign.
Well, it was a good run. While the origin of G.I. Joe has been told many times, in the interest of learning all there is to know, and perhaps even serving as a refresher course for some of us, let's talk about the birth of the action figure. Picture it. Rhode Island, 1923. Henry, Hill, and Herman Hassenfeld, three brothers who had immigrated to the United States from Poland, were making a living selling cloth leftovers from the textile business, making items like hat liners and covers for pencil boxes. And while this may not sound like a lucrative business, within just 7 years, Hassenfeld Brothers Incorporated had expanded to 200 employees and almost $500,000 in annual sales. It's over $7 million in today's dollar.
First off, that's a lot of H's in all those names. But also, that's all made from just like pencil boxes and cloth and zippers and pouches and things like that?
Well, so they had various forms of school supplies that went in them as well. As you'll learn, by 1935, they'd started producing pencils themselves, and this was going to be a long-running thing for Hasbro. They make a lot of money off pencils. That sounds so weird to say, but for as long as they've been around, until they split off later on, and the pencil business becomes a whole separate thing for them.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Before the end of the decade, they would decide to extend that concept to not just school supplies for children, but they'd get dabble in toys as well. Initially, they started with medical sets and modeling clay. Pretty basic, pretty normal.
Yeah.
They'd even produce a junior air raid warden kit, which included flashlights and toy gas masks.
Oh, boy. Man, it really makes you feel bad for their youth if their toys were gas masks and anti-air raid warden kits.
Yeah, it definitely paints a pretty dark picture.
Yeah. Now, did that affect like the way that they supplied, like, did the school supplies, or did they do both?
It did, with the exception of pencil production, but only because demand for school supplies was on the decline around 1942. Hill Hassenfeld, the man with the most impossible to pronounce first name, died in 1943, and that made Henry the CEO. And then Henry's son, Merrill, became president. It was around this time the company started to utilize plastics in their line for the first time, which would be an important factor later on in the story. And that'll bring us all the way up to the 1950s, when the company introduced its first major hit.
That was Mr. Potato Head, right?
That's right. You know about Mr. Potato Head?
I do. It was actually designed by George Lerner in the early 1940s. After numerous rejections from various companies, it was finally picked up by the H brothers, the Hassenfeld brothers, Incorporated, to go into production in 1952, despite what I think is important being BYOP.
What's a BYOP?
Oh, it's Bring Your Own Potato. Mr. Potato Head was a huge hit, but you had to bring your own potato. It's a vital part of the toy history. It was the first toy advertised on television to children, like specifically to children, but it sold 1 million units in the first year alone.
That's insane. And it's that success that drove the company for the next decade, becoming one of the largest toy companies in the business, which brings us all the way up to 1963. Merrill had now become CEO. His father passed away in 1960.
And this is when Stan Weston gets involved?
Essentially, yes. So this is where we really start to get into the origins, more or less. Stan Weston is a licensing agent from Manhattan. He'd come up with a concept for a male figure that would appeal to boys, a military-based soldier with various outfits and weapons. Stan shows up with some cardboard mock-ups and pitches the idea to Merrill.
And he says no, right?
He gets shot down in a big way. Merrill is explicitly clear that they don't make dolls. And although that seems crazy in hindsight, the doll business was extremely aggressive at this time and definitely hard to get a foothold into. Just in general, the idea of taking on Barbie in any context was unheard of.
They were huge at that time, right?
They were it at the time. Yeah, absolutely. And so this is where Don Levine gets involved. Don is the head of research and development at this time, and he thinks that that's a great idea for an untapped market. One day, Don's walking down the street. He sees an artist mannequin in an art supply store. An artist mannequin, if you're not familiar, is it's like a blank figure. Artists pick it up and they can put it in tons of different specific poses to help them when they're drawing something. They're very versatile, basically. Don snatches up half a dozen of these bad boys, spends about 2 weeks creating detailed models based off of Weston's characters, shows them off to Hassenfeld, who'd been on vacation the whole time. And guess what?
He loved them.
He loved them. He loved them so much, he bought the concept from Weston for $100,000. Now, as the story goes, Weston could have taken $50,000 and a 1% royalty on the line, but he went with the flat buyout.
Ooh, that hurts.
Yeah, he definitely didn't do himself any favors there, but it's hard to predict the future of things like this.
Yeah, that's not uncommon. I know Kevin Eastman sold his shares of TMNT just a year before Nickelodeon bought up the entire license. He had to have lost a fortune.
Yeah, I think I don't remember the exact details on it, but I think it was like $1 million or $1 billion sale, and he got none of it because he sold all of his shares. So, I mean, the same deal. You can imagine 1% on every G.I. Joe thing to date. His whole bloodline would be set up forever. But again, it's hard to be like, you made a dumb mistake, because at the time, $100,000 was a fortune. Well, let's be realistic. $100,000 right now is a lot of money for me.
It would be hard for me to pass that up for sure. Still,
yeah. So anyway, they bought the rights and they're good to go. Don had originally planned to name each character individually and had named each prototype. He had a soldier named Rocky. They had a sailor named Skip. They had a pilot named Ace. But after being told to stick with just one name, Don Levine pulled the iconic name we know today from the movie Ernie Powell, The Story of G.I. Joe. And so, in 1964, we finally got our first 12-inch toy, which we can now finally call an action figure, a term created to avoid having to use the word doll to describe it. In its first 2 years, G.I. Joe brought in between $35 and $40 million and accounted for nearly 2/3 of the company's total sales.
I'd like to have 1% of that. But,
No
other
doubt.
than these four figures, okay, so other than those four, what else was in the line?
The only other one was they did introduce an African-American figure in 1965, but it was just the same face as the white figure, painted brown.
Oh, boy. I guess they want to forget that. I don't think I want to ask too many questions.
I think we would all like to forget that. But they made tons of accessories, just about anything you can imagine. This went on until about 1968.
Okay, so that's when we can actually call it like Hasbro, right? Like that's when they changed their name and went public?
Right. So in 1968, they go public. They'd been using the name Hasbro for a while, but it wasn't like technically official. They had it on their products, but they hadn't released. There was no stock to buy. Their name was still technically Hassenfeld Brothers Incorporated.
Hasbro is so much better.
Yeah, and also it's even though this is a long conversation to get to that, that's where Hasbro comes from. Bro means brothers. Hassenfeld Brothers.
That's something I didn't know.
Right. So around 1969. America's getting pretty unhappy with how things are going in the Vietnam War. Tough time to have a military figure. And Hasbro wanted to downplay that in their military line as well. And so this is the first kind of evolution of G.I. Joe as we saw it in the marketplace. They start to move on to their next phase. What was originally called The Adventures of G.I. Joe, and then shortly thereafter, simply The Adventure Team.
Oh boy, and the Adventure Team had some crazy innovations going for it. That's when they brought in that flocked hair, the velvety stuff, the legendary Kung Fu grip, which that's actually great, and then eagle-eyed vision, which is basically just allowed him to look around to see if anyone was looking at his cool, rugged, manly man beard. In 1975, the Adventure Team universe would expand to add its roster Mike Power, the Atomic Man, and Bullet Man. The year after that, Hasbro released a line of inexpensive mannequins in the G.I. Joe style called the Defenders, which would ultimately be the final products in the line altogether.
It's not to say exclusively that these decisions caused the end of the line. Yes, those are unusual decisions, but also, in all fairness, it is the 60s. The 1970s were really hard on Hasbro. They had two huge failures. They had javelin darts, which were declared unsafe by the government. If you're not familiar with javelin darts,
Those are things that killed people, right?
So I had a variation of these when I was a kid for sure, except we called them lawn darts, and essentially it was
Yeah.
it was just like it sounds. It's a gigantic javelin. You try to throw it into like a circle, into across the yard, and somebody definitely got hurt and or killed from them. But I don't know. Toys were different when I was a kid.
Family members got to run.
Their other big failure, which I did not have as a kid, but would love to see now, is called the hypo squirt, which was a water gun shaped like a hypodermic needle, and really needs no further clarification as to why it failed.
Oh my gosh, I've never heard of that one. I'm gonna have to Google that one.
I bet those are worth a lot of money because that's such because that stuff was all recalled, obviously. There were other factors as well. Crude oil prices were on the rise in a big way, so that means the cost of plastic was increasing as well. This is something that will factor in later on in G.I. Joe's history, where the cost of plastic is too daunting to continue to produce. And then on top of all of that, Merrill Hassenfeld dies in 1979, and Steven steps into the role of CEO. And buddy, what a way to take over a company! Two big failures, massive debt, a lot of problems.
But hello, 1982. Bring on the Joes.
So everything that was wrong about 1969 was right about 1982. The political climate in 1982 was completely different. Military toys were totally in fashion again. Hasbro's senior vice president of international marketing, Bob Prupus, had been brainstorming ways to bring the line back. Codenamed Operation Blastoff, the new line would incorporate science fiction into the line with a Mission Impossible vibe, which was all the rage in the late 70s. He added lasers and jetpacks to tanks and guns.
Codename Operation Blastoff sounds awesome. So the company resisted, so Purpose brought in some help. Colleagues Kurt Bazigian, Ron Rudat, Greg Bernstein, and Steve DeGuano joined his team. Inspired by the classic green army man of his youth, and hoping to fight the rising price of petroleum, the raw material needed for plastic, they started modifying figures from the TV show Chips, which great show. But that was made by his rival company, Mego. The figures would be cheaper to produce because they were 3 3/4 inches tall and had the added bonus of putting them in direct competition with Kenner's new Star Wars toys. In order to really compete, however, they decided instead they would up their articulation from 5 points to 10.
So Purpose had gone through a series of pitching these ideas to Hasbro, and it's kind of continually getting shot down. He would try to reinvent it, and it just wouldn't happen. So Purposes comes down to his last 2 weeks. He's teamed up with Griffin Bacall, the marketing firm that manages Hasbro's advertising, to deliver a pitch that Hasbro would accept. And that's when the idea came to fruition. Instead of advertising a toy for kids on TV, the concept, which at this point had lots of government regulations, including a limit of 7 seconds of animation or special effects, a total runtime limit, and a requirement to show kids playing with the actual toys. Imagine if video games had that. show actual game footage and not
That'd be nuts.
CG.
No more E3 trailers.
I know. Instead of abiding by these limits, they would give G.I. Joe their own comic book and simply advertise that.
So there's 2 different stories on how Marvel Comics came to publish the G.I. Joe comic. Jim Shooter, who was the editor-in-chief, claims that both the president of Hasbro and Marvel were at a charity event when they met in the men's room. Standing next to each other, relieving themselves, why there, they began to talk, and the topic of reactivating the trademark of G.I. Joe came up. Marvel wasted no time jumping on the opportunity and promised to take care of it for him.
Man, this is the weirdest. I mean, like, I don't know a lot about social etiquette, but having any conversation at a urinal, much less a business transaction, seems really unlikely. At the very least, extremely awkward. I'll stick to the other story, which is what Kirk Bazigian has to say, that Griffin Bacall just sought out Marvel themselves and said, "This is our idea. This is what we want you to do."
Yeah, I mean, either way, a little bit more fun, but But $3 million was dedicated to a series of 30-second commercials for the G.I. Joe comic book, which didn't have to follow all those crazy guidelines, but they also happened to feature all of the figures and toys that would hit shelves.
So meanwhile, over at Marvel Comics, Jim Shooter is looking for anyone willing to write the G.I. Joe comic. And it turns out working on a toy property was pretty low on what writers at Marvel wanted to work on. It wasn't until he got to the end of that list that he struck on then low-level editor Larry Hama, hallowed be his name. Here's a clip from Larry talking about the experience.
The comic book company's offices were laid out in such a way that, like, my office was the last office, at the far end. So when they were looking for somebody to write this new toy comic, they started at the other end and worked their way down, and everybody passed on it. And I was the last guy they asked. And I had been trying for years to get, some extra, freelance work as a writer, because I think, I started out making $25 a page for drawing comics. And one day I found out that the guy that was writing the comic that I was drawing was making like $50 or $60 for writing it. And he could write a 22-page story in one day, and it took me all day to draw like one page. And I said, "What's wrong with this picture?" I said, "Wow, like I could do that." And so I went to every editor and I said, "Hey, how about giving me some writing work?" And they said, "Well, you can't write. You're the guy that draws this stuff." So, I guess they were desperate at that point. And that's how I got the gig.
So Larry had been recently working on a pitch for a book he called Fury Force. Fury Force was the story of Nick Fury's son, not Samuel L. Jackson at this point, who would lead a 7-person strike team against S.H.I.E.L.D's natural enemy, Hydra. Many elements of that story seemed adaptable, so Larry began shifting the structure of this book into what would become G.I. Joe.
Marvel nailed down so many things about the early days of this line. Jim Shooter suggested that the name of the unit be called G.I. Joe, especially since each character would have their own specialty and place on the team. When Marvel inquired about who this new anti-terrorist organization would fight, it was Archie Goodwin who casually threw out the name Cobra, which designer Ron Rudat developed into the enemy logo we know today.
Wow. Good old Ron. He also designed the look of every character in the early years. Those images would go to Larry, who had begun creating the initial roster, and would write down detailed notes on index cards to share with Hasbro to help keep them all straight and organized. Here's Larry again talking about the origin of the file card.
We knew that they were going to have to, they were continually adding characters, and I thought, geez, 10 characters is a lot. But, throwing in the Cobras, you've already got 14, 15 characters, and they're going to keep adding more. So I needed a methodology to keep track of who these people are. So for my own sake and peace of mind, I created these, what I call dossiers, where I just sort of delineated who these characters were in very short paragraphs, and I even had like psychological assessments and things like that, and so I could keep track of them. But eventually they made their way over to Hasbro, and somebody said, "Hey, wow, we should put these on the package." and nobody had done that before. So, and that became, those file cards on the backs of action figures are now like an industry standard. But that was a complete, it wasn't a strategy decision, It was something that evolved from something else entirely.
And so it would seem that G.I. Joe was finally ready to launch. Well, at least it would have been, except for the release of Empire Strikes Back. Hasbro didn't want to butt heads with the iconic Kenner property, which I totally get, so they pushed the release back by 1 year. And it was during this 1 year that a lot of development happened. They started to flesh out the idea of Cobra, because up until this point, Hasbro had not even considered the idea that they would need to make an enemy, that enemy figures wouldn't sell. This is when the file cards became adapted and started to be included on the back of the packaging. Cobra Commander was created, even though the only way you could get them was to mail in some flag points and get them through the mail order catalog.
Is that the one with the hood?
So the first mail order Cobra Commander that came out was the one with the steel faceplate.
Okay.
And an easy way to tell this is because he's one of the only enemies that actually has the straight arms. The hooded Cobra Commander was also a mail-in.
Okay.
And that brings us up to the launch. So the original 13-figure lineup consisted of Hawk, Flash, Grand Slam, Breaker, Rock and Roll, Short Fuse, Zap, Stalker, Clutch, Grunt, Scarlet, Steeler, and Snake Eyes. figured they had chosen to release with no paint whatsoever to cut back on the cost of the line.
So the initial line brought in $50 million in the first year and would double that in the second, introducing yet another point of articulation, 2 swivel joints at the character's biceps, allowing the arms to turn inward toward the body, which is crucial to holding the weapons in a more realistic fashion. This original line would come to be known as straight arm figures, while the re-releases of the first wave would become known as Series 1.5.
We'll get more into that in later episodes, but for now I think that brings us to a stopping point. From here on out, everything in the G.I. Joe universe is a little too big for just one episode. We'd like to thank everyone out there for listening, and hope that you'll follow us on YouTube, where our first series of videos will be launching on July 4th.
In addition to that, we want to hear from you. Please follow us on Twitter at AnythingJoesPod, on Instagram at AnythingJoes, or drop us a line at anythingjoespodcast@gmail.com.
We want to hear from the community, and just like the name implies, anything is fair game. We want to see cosplay. We want to see your custom figures. I want to know your top 10 figures of all time. We want to know what you want to see from us as we find our voice and develop our channel. Unless you've already written us, in which case, thanks for checking in, Mom. I'm doing just fine.
We hope to see you next time, and remember, the only rule here is
Anything Joe's.
Wow.